Everyone, and welcome back. This is Professor Hall, and we are talking today about 6 things to know about Jane Eyre. Last time we had a summary of the beginning part of the novel without any spoilers, the first 20 or so chapters. Now we're going to talk about some of the background information that helps you understand the book a little bit better. And then next time we will look at some of the themes. And then that will be followed by another lecture that summarizes the end and also finally talking about the themes of the last third of the book. So that's the game plan. And let's get started. The author's personality. There we have a picture of Charlotte Bronte. Charlotte Bronte lived from 1816 till 1855. She was the sister of Anne and Emily Bronte. I mentioned last time that they also wrote novels. So Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights and Anne Bronte's most famous book, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. The three sisters wrote initially under the pseudonyms of Acton, Currer, and Ellis Bell. And this led to some speculation by readers at the time that they were all one person. Charlotte Bronte dispelled those rumors by admitting who they were later on after one of her sisters died. I believe it was Anne, but I cannot be sure of. It might have been both of them. They died quite young. And so she admitted who they were, and now we know. Jane Eyre is not completely based on the author's life, although it was subtitled an autobiography. That's because it's written in first person, which we're going to talk more about in a little bit. But it is a novel. However, she did use some of her experiences as inspiration for the character, for several of the characters, as well as some of the plot points. So it's kind of interesting to see how her life kind of inspired some of these things. For example, in terms of looks, Charlotte did not really believe that she was attractive, and in one of her letters, she said that in Jane Eyre, she showed readers, quote, a heroine as plain and as small as myself. That's supposed to say plain, not pain. A heroine as plain and as small as myself, which really would have been revolutionary at the time. Even today, if you look on TV, how many shows are from the perspective of a person who is not attractive, right? And then for a book to have somebody who was unattractive and very clear that she was unattractive, especially in a romance or a love story. She's not blonde-haired and blue-eyed, or she's not tall and willowy and thin and perfect. Bronte also did not feel that she was docile or resigned. So that means accepting whatever happens peacefully and without complaint. Many women at the time were expected to be, and she wrote to friends, kind of feeling out of sorts that that's not the way that she was. And Jane shares these traits. She's not just plain and small, but she's stubborn and strong-willed. And for modern readers, that is one of the things that we love about her. But for readers at the time, again, it would have been a little bit unusual that it's not just, it's just not something that was done. Many of the things that Jane thought or said. So, breaking a few barriers in that way. The author's life and family. So Bronte lost her mother at the age of 5, and she was sent to live with who she called an unpleasant maiden aunt. So a maiden being an aunt who never married or had children. But at the same time, this person, was somewhat of an inspiration for Mrs. Reed, who is Jane's aunt, who is very unpleasant to her. Later, then, she was sent off to a very harsh boarding school at the age of 10. Typhus broke out at the school, and 2 of her sisters, Maria and Elizabeth, died, and then she was brought back home. So there are several girls who die at the school, and Maria and Elizabeth are kind of inspirations for those characters. And obviously, it would have made two of your sisters dying at this very harsh boarding school where you're wearing thin clothes and not eating enough and not getting proper medical care. And particularly with typhus. Typhus is a flea-borne disease often. So the fleas become infected when they bite infected animals such as rats or cats, and then they also bite then people. Very similar to how the bubonic plague was spread, which, of course, in a place that is filthy and unclean, you're going to have rats everywhere. You're going to have fleas on the rats and ticks and everything else, right? So, also like Jane, Charlotte works as a teacher and then as a governess at different points in her life. Now, part of that work as a teacher can be kind of reflected in the book Villette, but other parts here in Jane Eyre, as Jane teaches the young ladies at Lowood, and then later when she becomes a governess to Adele. Later in life, Bronte's brother Branwell contracted tuberculosis. He was an alcoholic as well as an opium and laudanum addict. Laudanum is also an opioid, and a bit like morphine. Today, people take laudanum sometimes, not very often because it's going out of popularity, thankfully, but sometimes today people take laudanum when they are coming off of heroin, because it has similar properties, although less so. But at that time, if you're shooting up laudanum, that's basically similar effects. So Branwell and Charlotte got along well as children. They would create tiny books together and play together and things of that nature. However, he may have been a source of inspiration for the character of John Reed, Jane's cousin. He also has a problem with addiction later on in life that we find out. Not to spoil everything, but just as a small detail. So those are some things to look for. The author's husband. A few years before writing Jane Eyre, Charlotte Bronte became friends with Arthur Nichols, a poor pastor who worked for her father. It's disputed whether or not this is his photograph, but I'm including it anyway, just so you kind of get a picture. But prior to this, she had an unrequited love of a man who was older than her and her teacher, who she wrote letters to. And almost I think that there's more people who talk about that than she and her husband, which is interesting to me. But at any rate, they fell in love. She was forced to reject Arthur because her father did not approve. He worked for her father. He was a minister. He was not wealthy. And so because of his poor station, Charlotte's father forbid them from getting married. After being rejected, he planned on becoming a missionary to Australia. So you can see some of that in St. John, possibly, who's also a missionary. But he changed his mind because he was in love and began to court Charlotte again. They were at last married, and some of her friends, particularly Elizabeth Gaskell, who's another writer of the time, another author, they thought that Arthur was too passionate and rigid, passionate about church rather than Charlotte, and too rigid and law-giving. But although Charlotte died from complications to pregnancy about 9 months after they married, just before her death, she wrote these letters to her friends saying that she loved Arthur. He was dearer to her today than he was 6 months ago. They seemed to have a happy union. So the author died quite young from the pregnancy complications. However, We see some of her personality traits in Jane, and we also see some of Arthur's personality in possibly both St. John and Rochester. I don't think either one of those characters is entirely based upon him, but I don't think that Jane is entirely based upon the author's personality either. And I want us to be careful to not draw too many conclusions about what these people were like based on a fictional book. But I do think that it's interesting that she sort of had these as inspiration. It's not a direct one-to-one comparison, but certainly it seems like people were inspired by those she saw around her, which is often where writers take their inspiration. 4. First-person narration. I am no bird, and no net ensnares me. I'm a free human being with an independent will. The book was really shocking to readers at the time, and some of that are the plot points that I sort of hinted at before, with the mystery and the Gothic elements, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But a lot of it had nothing to do with the fact that this was a Gothic novel. Other Gothic novels had come out. However, the first-person narration would have been quite striking. Jane is a governess, as we talked about before. That's a position that was often marginalized, meaning she's kind of pushed to the side. Governesses take care of children. They're not thought of much in society. And as I said before, they're not members of the family, but they're not really servants either. And so they're in this weird position of having an education, being in a wealthy household, not really having wealth themselves, and knowing too that this position is only for a certain period of time, for however long the child needs them, age-wise. So it's not exactly even like being a teacher today, where you might teach at a school for, I know some people have taught at one school for 20 or 30 years. Even back then, a lot of teachers would be at a school for a year or two until they married. Many times, teachers were not allowed to be married if they were women, which is a whole other kettle of fish that we don't have time to go into. But yeah, that is part of it. Jane's gender as well as her position in society. The entire story is told from her perspective, and it's not just that she's telling the story, but it's a really intimate telling. She talks about her feelings, and she expresses her emotions, in a passionate way. So she shows herself to be a strong and capable, intelligent, passionate woman, as opposed to being a docile, retiring, submissive, lowly servant that people think she should be. So even though in other ways, and I'll get into this in the thing with in the lecture on themes, in other ways the book goes with social expectations and the expectations of social class, Jane telling her own story really would have gone against those types of traditions. We feel Jane's pain when she's tortured by her cousins, abused by the school, shattered at the loss of a friend. We're drawn into her tale. We feel her interest for Rochester grow into love. It's a scandalous relationship, but we want it to happen anyway. So all of these things really not only shocked readers, but really drew them into the story. He is more myself than I am. Whatever our two souls are made of, his and mine are the same. As scholar Sonia Meyer explains, this is, I think, from the Victorian Web, which is a website about Victorian literature and art and history and other things. Sonia Meyer explains, Bronte's narrative strategy could have been seen as having ramifications for society at large by changing people's ways of thinking about gender and class. No doubt such currents of thought would have shocked many in Victorian England. For example, Rochester has long sections where he talks to Jane and discloses information about his past. But the reader really isn't as intrigued with this wealthy man's story as much as they're drawn in by Jane's thoughts and feelings and reactions to Rochester's tale. So the narration shocks in other ways. Her perspective is limited, so she doesn't know everything about her employer or Thornfield or the house where she resides. But I really want you to watch for the places where Jane and Rochester, as they're forming a friendship and then as she's falling in love with him, they have these very long talks. So watch not just for Rochester's words as he's telling these secrets about himself, but really also Jane's reactions. What does she think about it? How does her spirit react? How does her heart react? All of those things. The reader, on the whole, is discovering answers to who is this man? What is this place? What's going on here? All of these mysteries as the tale unfolds. So again, why it's so important, and I keep saying this, don't look up spoilers, because it is such an intriguing story to discover things as Jane discovers them. It's very her limitations help to make us wonder what's going on and help us, keep turning the pages. Structure. So the book is told really in 5 acts. In the first act, we see Jane at her aunt's house, Aunt Reed, where she is neglected and mistreated. Then in the second act, she is sent to Lowood School. She has trouble fitting in, but then finds a comforting place among friends and kind teachers. At the end of the second act, I mentioned this before, we fast forward through Jane's school years as she leaves for employment outside of the school. She had been teaching there for 2 years, but she is now on her own. So in the third act, Jane is employed at Thornfield. That's where she meets and falls in love with Mr. Rochester. In the fourth act, Jane meets more of her family members, and she stays with them for a time and is employed at a country school. So a little bit of time away from Thornfield. And then in the denouement, it's a fancy French word meaning the end. In the end, in the fifth act, we find out what became of all of the characters of the novel several years later. So that is essentially how the story is structured. If you think of it, let me get my pen here. If you think of it in that typical plot arc way, as best as I can draw it, we have a long time before we come to Thornfield. And I think kind of Thornfield happens here. It's almost like 1 and 2 here. We have a lot of rising action, right? And then we kind of come to 4. I think 3 and 4 would kind of be here at any rate. Then we come to the conclusion in Act 5. So that watch for that kind of structure, the rising action and the little twists and turns of the mysteries in Acts 3 and 4. I'm calling them acts like a play. They're not broken up quite like that, but essentially that's sort of how I see it. The plot is basically structured as a Bildungsroman, which is another fancy literary term. Bildungsroman are coming-of-age novels in which the hero or heroine journeys through painful and joyous experiences that help shape their identity and lead them from innocence to experience. So the protagonist is educated by travels in the world. She learns moral lessons and develops spiritually and psychologically. Being forced away from home on a journey, that would kind of be like leaving Gateshead. Undergoing psychological and moral growth. We have various things here for this book. I mentioned the typhus at the school, other things that happen at Thornfield that kind of take her from being a child at 19 really to being an adult. The goal is maturity, self-discovery. There's some kind of usually conflict kind of with society, and here it's a lot to do with gender and social class. How is she struggling because of those things, and how does she overcome what society would have thought of as limitations? So watch for ways in which Jane is naive and innocent at the beginning of the novel. Um, even, she's neglected. She sees death at a young age, but at the same time, she's quite innocent about the world. What happens to bring her into adulthood? What trials does she face? How is she forced to leave that childhood or adolescence behind and really become a woman? And how does she develop psychologically or spiritually in other ways? All right, last one. 6, a romantic Gothic novel. There is a love story, but I'm going to back up here. There is a love story, but it's not, I don't mean romance in that type of way. Romance is not just a love story, but a particular period of literature. And it was marked by escapism. So prior to the Romantics, we had a lot of reasonable, logical writing for political purposes, sometimes stories that were meant to educate or have a moral. The romances got away from that. Readers wanted to escape and be entertained. There was a quest for beauty and art. So a lot of times the use of faraway or non-normal, supernatural, antique, fanciful locations. So Thornfield is a little bit fanciful. It's this beautiful, huge mansion and estate. Rochester is quite wealthy. And for a girl who came from, this poor school, it would have been amazing. At the same time, it's not far away or antique, but it's not really normal either. And there's something going on there. Some of the books had a historical perspective or an interest in the past. So you can think of Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter, which was written in the 1800s, but depicts things back in the 1600s. Characterization and mood. So sometimes, at least with Gothic novels, and stories, there's the grotesque, like Edgar Allan Poe, right? There's a sense of terror and fear and the use of the odd and mysterious. On the other end of this would be more like transcendentalism, where we are showing the best of mankind. Sometimes the Gothic stories explore the worst of mankind. Now, this is not quite as dark as Edgar Allan Poe, and we don't have, beating hearts under the floorboards. But I do want, look for some of the things that indicate the Gothic genre, and that create this mysterious mood of thunderstorms and trees being split in half by lightning and mysterious visions and dreams. All of those things are kind of going on. Interest in the imagination, improbable plots, and a suspension of disbelief. There are things that happen in this novel that are improbable, that I think a lot of modern readers are like, oh, that would never happen. And so they kind of get annoyed with it. But you have to suspend your disbelief and just kind of go with the story. And exist an interest in external nature. So looking at nature as a way of coming closer to God, which again would be kind of like the transcendentalists. Nature is beautiful, but nature is also terrifying. You can't control the sea. You can't control a thunderstorm. You can't control a hurricane. So it's beautiful, but it's also terrifying at the same time. Heightened emotions, definitely something to look for in this book, especially since we're seeing it from Jane's perspective, first person. So she's not only got very strong emotions, but she's telling us about how she feels, which again, before this period of time, it would be more likely to be logic and reason of having more importance than emotion. subjectivity and form and meaning, kind of going along with emotion, that we can't look at things objectively because they're from our own perspective. And an experimentation with form. Didactic writing was for teaching purposes. That is not what this book is about. It might have some lessons, but the real emphasis is the story, not the moral lessons that the reader gets from the story. So, some elements in imaginative setting. Here, yes, we have almost a dark, gloomy castle. It's an old house with secrets and mysteries. The atmosphere of mystery and suspense. Omens, we're going to talk more about later after we examine the end of the novel. But omens are like things that foretell either something good is going to happen or something bad is going to happen. So visions and dreams use foreshadowing. So look for some of those things where Jane has a dream and it's kind of foreshadowing something that's going to happen. It's almost like in psychological terms, it's like her subconscious knows something that her conscious mind can't really figure out. Or for readers at the time who would have looked at it in religious terms, it's almost like God's trying to tell her something. Either way you look at it, it's a use of foreshadowing. Pathetic fallacy, in this case, the weather conveying the mood of the story. Supernatural or inexplicable events, again, coincidences. Romance, yes, here romance means romance. Powerful love, strong emotions, lovers parted, unrequited love, women in distress, all of those things happen. Tyrannical men. Oh, and then I have women in distress twice. Oh, geez, in a class where we're talking about feminism and gender roles and things. But yeah, men being tyrannical and not as much in this story, but in other stories. Pure romances were concerned just with beauty and love and the beauty of nature, but Gothic romances really look at darker parts of the human soul. So pre-Freudian psychology, trying to figure out why people feel the way they do and why they act the way they do and why they make their decisions that they make. So an excerpt. Here is just a short example before we close. Jane has a symbolic dream, just to kind of set up the excerpt. Sorry. To set up the excerpt, Jane has a symbolic dream one night in Thornfield. She looks up in the ceiling and it sort of turns to clouds. A human form, reminiscent of a watercolor painting that she did, appears. And here's what she says. She, meaning the woman, she broke forth as never moon yet burst from cloud. A hand first penetrated the sable folds and waved them away. Then, not a moon, but a white human form shone in the azure, inclining a glorious brow earthward. It gazed and gazed upon me. It spoke to my spirit. Immeasurably distant was the tone, yet so near it whispered to my heart, "My daughter, flee temptation." Okay, so what do we have here? Jane's mother has died. That's why she was with her aunt. And this could possibly be her mother. We have these beautiful colors here. Sable, which is like a tan. Then we have a white human form shining through the azure, which is a deep blue. Glorious brow. So a woman breaks forth like the moon shining. She puts a hand to penetrate the sable folds. I believe that's the bed curtains, to wave them away. And instead of seeing the moon, Jane sees this bright, shining woman and gazing upon her and inclines her face down toward Jane from heaven and says, "Flee temptation." My daughter. Is this a vision of her mother? Is it a ghost? Is it a it doesn't, a lot of times my daughter would be a phrase that somebody would use, not necessarily her mom. So is it a vision? Is it a dream? Is it an omen warning her of something? We don't know. But that is a great example here and in other places how Jane's emotions are reflected in her dreams and sometimes a vision where she sees something while she's awake. Again, it's like her subconscious understanding things her conscious mind doesn't. So that's another thing to look for. I hope that you learned a little bit today about how the author's life influenced her work, how some aspects of Gothic literature and romances, and a little bit about the structure and the narration of this story. So hopefully all these things will help you to love the book as much as I do. And next time we are going to talk about themes in Jane Eyre. So I look forward to talking with you guys about that, and I can't wait to see your thoughts on the book. Thanks.